in places where there were existential risk, which just means there's a high frequencies of these kinds of disruptions. So the communities feel a threat to their existence. In places where there's high existential risk, those societies either form fundamentalist religions or they establish fascist and totalitarian dictatorships, basically military warlord societies. And so now let's take climate change and the ecological crisis. What climate change does is creates the conditions for existential threat everywhere on Earth during the time when we need to be cultivating these capacities for discernment and acuity. So this is really scary and really dangerous for us because we have to recognize that the large-scale dynamics of the world, like the ocean current, not the little waves on the top, the ocean current of the world is moving all of humanity toward fundamentalist religion and military dictatorships because of the uncertainty.
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. This week on the Poetry of Predicament podcast, help me welcome designer of regenerative systems, a polymath of the highest order, a thought leader, father, and educator, Joe Brewer. Well, I'm truly excited today to be hosting this episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast and to be welcoming Joe Brewer to this podcast. Full disclosure, I've been following you, Joe, for at least 5 years. And there are particular moments when, being involved with this rather dismal topic day by forever, it can wear on a person. And
Yes, it can.
And many of the pieces that I've been exposed to that have involved you over the years have been not just informative and not just inspiring, but also moving. There was this particular combination that came up a couple of years back where you did some video clips produced by Katie Teague that were just absolutely tear-inducing. They were just so beautiful and involved so much of what I might call my implicit system, the only system really worth talking about these days in terms of actualizing any kind of change or even human connection. It just went straight there. So I know it was a tremendous amount of Katie Teague's expertise and artistry, but obviously you were the subject matter. And so there's something that's actually what I'm trying to do here is not just acknowledge you and let you know what a difference particular pieces of your body of work and expression have made on me, what a difference they've made. But I'd also like to just kind of go right to the starting point of the conversation that I'd like to go for.
Yes, please.
And I'll mention also just a brilliant recent podcast interview you did with Daniel Thorson on his Emerge podcast. And when I grow up, I want to be Daniel Thorson. He just has a wonderful way about him. And the two of you together were quite magical. And I've got to say, I hope you'll bear with me. I have had limited patience for cultural design, strategic stuff, the bulk of what you say you're about. And it's only because of those impressions I was just talking about that I've tracked with you. And another person that does seemingly similar conversation is Daniel Christian Wall. And I lose patience because it's so lofty and it's such a big gap to get there. And I'm working in the people in the trenches, trying to build a bridge out to where y'all are talking about. And I get lost. I can't reach with you. And what happened in the interview with you and Daniel that I wanted to use as also a starting point is it was the first time, and I'm sure you've covered this ground, so please forgive me. I haven't read everything you've put out. But it was the first time I'd heard you say so clearly, what are some of the essential inner tools that people might need? People from regular walk of life, you know, I'm concerned, I'm a parent, I'm in a community, I got a job. How can I be a part of moving into a better way of being on the planet? And that means I got to have some inner skills that are going to shift or expand, some capacities that will grow to meet that challenge. And so this is, again, the first time I'd heard you say it, and specifically so clearly. So I'm kind of laying out, thank you for sitting through all this. I particularly wanted to start there because, again, that's where my work and yours appear to interface. So,
Yeah.
and what specifically what it was about is Daniel asked you something along the lines of what are some of the essential skills that people will need as they take this kind of thing on where they are, not necessarily where you, Joe Brewer, is, but where they are. And if I can recap to the best of my ability, which I hope you will correct if I get wrong, is that they'll need advanced self-regulation skills and a psychological flexibility. Now, for the folks that follow me on a regular basis in this body of work, books or videos and so on, they'll know that this is right in the zone of what my work addresses. I was stoked. I was thrilled to hear you drawing that bridge back to regular folks in regular tools and so on. So, two things, Joe. Would you briefly introduce yourself as you would most like to be introduced now? Who are you now? What are you now? What are you focusing on? And could you then pick up that thread in whatever way suits you? And Joe, by the way, thanks so much for making time. I know you're very, very busy, and I really appreciate this. This is it's a real gift to be able to spend time with you.
Well, let me start by saying that I'm, at my core, I'm a Missouri chicken farmer. I grew up on a chicken farm in Missouri, and I've just had a strange enough life that I'm currently living in Costa Rica and have gotten to travel to several parts of the world. And so at my core, I'm really a simple person too, although a simple person with I would say the curse of intellect and the curse of empathy for the place I grew up.
Mm.
So these are also my gifts, but I grew up in a way that kept me largely separate from the culture. And so it created hardship for me as a child to have the intellect and the emotional sensitivities that I have. Now, let me describe myself briefly this way. I'm a person who studies the philosophy of life for how to live a good and meaningful life, with the privilege of getting about 10 years of university training where I studied physics and philosophy and mathematics and theater and dance. I did body-based practices as well and got very into complexity science, and did graduate work in atmospheric science, meaning that I studied the scientific tools and approaches for climate change. And later it was cognitive and behavioral science. How do people think, feel, and act? And more recently, cultural evolution, which is the rigorous ways of understanding social change. And now the work that I'm really empowered to do in a way that makes me feel really honored is that I'm helping to coordinate and cultivate the people around the world that are trying to heal and regenerate the earth.
Mm.
And there's a tremendous complex history of healing and regenerating the earth. You could tag things like the off the grid, back to the earth people of the 1960s and 70s as a major kind of era of that work. The professionalism of the environmental movement that in many ways took us off on the wrong track, and other things that we could name. But yeah, at my core, I'm an integrative thinker who has studied many different things and always driven by this empathy and compassion around feeling the suffering of the environment and people around me, as well as myself, to help me navigate the challenges that we're confronting. And this relates to the topic that you'd mentioned, where I was speaking with Daniel Thorson. And we discussed what are some of the tools that people need to have, or the capacities is maybe a better word, the capacities that people need to have. And there's a really beautiful convergence of research in behavioral science. You could look back across thousands of studies for 40 years and see that all social problems that arise that have to do with individual psychological development, they come back to two basic things. And the technical terms are emotion regulation and psychological flexibility. And I'll make this very concrete because I have a 2.5-year-old daughter. So my daughter is in a mode of cultivating these skills in this moment of her development. She's 2.5 years old, so she starts to become sad about something. Like she's remembering a place that we're not there now, and she becomes sad. Because she doesn't have emotion regulation skills, her sadness quickly becomes anger. And then in her anger, she might pick up something and throw it, or swing her arms and hit something. And she really can't regulate her emotions. You know, she's 2.5 years old. So she's dealing with this interaction between two different emotions, and she doesn't have the capacity right now to take a deep breath, pay attention to her feelings, notice that she's sad, and the anger is her frustration because she can't manage her sadness. And the outburst of behavior is the consequence of the anger. So there's this, interaction of several things going on. And emotion regulation is cultivating those capacities.
Right.
And so in a very simple way, or it's not actually simple, but we can all understand children who struggle with this. What gets really interesting is the perspective taking piece, which is the ability to create a frame of reference to see those emotions and behaviors as something other than ourselves, which is an illusion. We are still the person creating the separation and still experiencing the feelings. But perspective taking is constructing this scaffolding, in the moment, the ability to step out of the emotion to behavior, this direct feedback between emotion and behavior, and begin to reflect on it. And as we reflect on it, we can look from different perspectives if we have the skills to do it, which is the core thing that all mindfulness practice is about. So anyone who's done yoga or martial arts or meditation will recognize these basic skills. The thing that's interesting is how behavioral science has connected it to things like the rate of divorce, whether people finish high school, whether they finish college or attain higher levels of education. Because one of the ways that this is powerfully expressed is a very specific perspective-taking activity, which is the ability to have a perspective of imagining our future self, looking back at our present self, and then making strategic decisions. So let me make that very common. It's Friday night and you're in college. You have friends that want to go get beers and pizza, go see a movie, but you have a big exam on Monday morning. So the question is, as you imagine your future self on Monday morning, did you take the time over the next 2 days of the weekend to prepare for your exam so that you can then imagine a farther future self who has gotten good grades, who has moved toward finishing a degree, built a career, having some imagined success? That emotion regulation and perspective taking are the essential tools for doing that. And it turns out that all of our future successes in life depend on this ability to go back and forth between what do I feel like doing now and what should I do to prepare for the future. And so already we're in this domain that I suspect overlaps in many ways with the work that you've been doing.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that layout. And I'm just curious, I'd like to just throw in an element that I included in my first and only book a couple of years ago. And it's going to show up even more strongly in this next one and a workbook that goes with it. And that is really an element I never thought I'd be talking about as I have taken on this topic of collapse of Earth and human systems, is really, in a word, propaganda. That there has been an immense influence on us as a global culture, but particularly in the United States, where we are at the pinnacle of the business as usual human operating system. And, you know, starting back with Edward Bernays and his buddies, creating really what soon became the whole sales and marketing driver for the consumer production consumption paradigm. And then on the governmental side, how to create a compliant populace. And it really was never a hidden thing. And
No, it's been wide out and open the whole time, literally on billboards and on our TV screens.
Yeah. And now it's literally crawling into our brains, and, you know, at every conceivable level. And so I'm bringing this in after what you've said, because I almost never hear a science communicator about climate change or about the various issues that we're facing that will include the incredible, deliberate influence on our ability to both regulate and also the psychological flexibility, or the acuity, I think, is what you were really getting at in what you were just describing, for me to be able to have that tuned skill of looking ahead to Monday, knowing I've got the exam, knowing clearly what I need to be doing if I want to succeed in the exam, and so on. And all of that acuity is stunted in a reality where I'm supposed to override those innate abilities in the name of short-term gratification and so on. So I just wanted to say that. I don't know if that sparks you to add anything more, but it seems like an important fit. And I also wanted to express, not to you, but in general, my frustration with the science communicators, as brilliant as I know they are. I'll never get to that level. Here's to them. But if they aren't including those elements, I have a hard time taking them seriously. And it's just year after year, I'm finding myself like mildly disinterested in what they're putting out, because I don't see them including what look to me to be essential elements in this formula.
Yeah. I mean, in my work, let me share a little bit of where my perspective on this comes from. In 2007 and 2008, I worked at a think tank in Berkeley called the Rockridge Institute, which was founded by George Lakoff. And George Lakoff is a professor of linguistics and cognitive science, and he is one of the founding intellectuals for the field of cognitive linguistics. And cognitive linguistics is the study of how the body makes meaning through language. And this is a fundamental area of research for propaganda, because it helps us understand at two levels: how do human beings make meaning using the concepts and the language that we have, this amazing biological capacity for culture. And the other is, how can all of the knowledge about that be exploited to manipulate people? Because what happens is, as you start to learn about the way that the human mind and body process information, you have two things. You get liberated, in a sense. You become empowered to manage how that process works through conscious reflection, at least with a limited capacity, but more than you would without the knowledge. But if you are a manipulator of other people, that knowledge is easy to strategically deploy. And I'm using military language on purpose.
Oh, yeah.
Because propaganda was developed for militaries.
I'm with you. Keep going.
That if we think about this as like a giant multi-dimensional chess game,
Mm-hmm.
the people who know the strategies of manipulating language and emotions have a playing board that other people don't even know exists. And so making people aware of this playing board is like step one. You can't start to develop knowledge and skill at the game if you don't even know there's a game.
Right.
And what I see with the climate communicators or the science communicators, it's really a mix. Some of them do know this and speak about it, but even when they do, by and large, they don't understand other important things. For example, they don't know the science of psychopaths and sociopaths. And they don't appreciate the way that institutions create feedback loops that reinforce institutions.
Right.
And this gets into—
If I may just add one more element that I
Please.
would love to see if you would add this to the list, is we seem to have a culture-wide blind spot with regard to fairly established and well-tracked human shadow dynamics on the individual and cultural level. And if we are unaware of the shadow dynamics, which are clearly running our country now in full force, if a science communicator does not have, doesn't know what they don't know about the topic, then again, I'm just frustrated. I'm watching or listening, and I'm wondering, I'm supposed to hold this as valid, as somehow critically important information that will move us forward, and I don't.
Yeah,
so I just wanted to add that. I don't know if that fits in what you were just laying out. And
well, it does in a very specific way, which is framing is naming. So if you are able to analyze the semantic frames, and semantic frames are the structured processing of information in the body that enables us to have concepts. So frames are these fundamental parts of how the body processes information. If you don't have a semantic frame for something, then you don't have any structured information to respond to. So framing is naming, meaning that when we name the frame, it becomes a real structure to interact with. And if we don't have a way of naming the frame, if we don't have a way of creating a structure to react to, then we just react to information in the absence of the additional information that we need. It's like walking through a jungle. You know, I live in Costa Rica right now. There's a type of pit viper, a very small snake that sits on top of leaves. And if you're walking through the forest and you think that all the snakes are on the ground, you might use your hand to brush a leaf out of the way and get bitten by a snake, because you didn't even know that there was a structured threat that some snakes are small enough to lay on the leaves. Mm-hmm. So this is an example where naming and framing are the same. Before I take you on a hike, I will say, be careful of the leaves because there are snakes there. Mm-hmm. I just gave you a structured piece of information that you need to know, but if you'd never been in the tropical jungle, you wouldn't know.
Yeah.
So that's true in general, that we have structural threats that we can be completely blind to because we don't have a semantic frame for them.
Yeah.
And so propaganda in many ways is a way of creating the structured information with a design element that makes the structure invisible. that it's intentionally obscure. They're hiding the intentions from us as part of the design of the information. It's like in the 80s and 90s when we had these television commercials that would have a very attractive woman engaging in gestures and behaviors that are very sexual while eating popcorn because they're selling a brand of popcorn. Well, the obscurity is what's actually driving us to buy popcorn is the desire to have sex. But that's not conscious. What's conscious is, ooh, popcorn sounds good.
Yeah, right.
And so the design of the marketing makes the information invisible about what the intention and the strategy is.
Yeah.
And only when you study the marketing practices do you see it.
Right, right. Yeah.
Yeah, so this relates to something really important, which is the ability to discern. And I've studied complexity science, and one thing about complexity science is that, firstly, everything that humans actually care about, those things in the real world are actually complex systems. Like we care about dating and having romantic success. Human social interactions are complex systems, just as an example. So everything we actually care about from a scientific point of view, we would categorize as a complex system. So when we study complex systems, one of the things that we have to know is that there's an element of incompleteness, which means no matter how well we study the system that happens to be complex, we are always participating in it in a way that removes our ability to know what is going to happen. So we have to analyze and interpret the system in a way that includes our interactions with it. And this requires us to, sorry, I bumped my computer as I got excited. It requires us to discern how the system is influencing us, while at the same time, we are influencing the system. And this requires very subtle, I like the word you used, very subtle acuity. We have to be able to work with nuance, moment to moment, and navigate how we are interpreting, which means we have to update our interpretations moment to moment.
Yeah.
And there's a really amazing body of research that I'm trying to remember the name of the book, but I know that the researcher is a German cognitive psychologist. His name is Dietrich Dorner. And I'm trying to remember the name of the book, but his body of research was, he was looking at how do people make decisions when dealing with complexity. He used computer games. So he would have the test subject for his psychology experiments. They would sit at a computer and they would play these games with a simulation of a village. And there would be a time step like, it's year one, make decisions about how many cows you have. Make decisions about which kinds of crops you plant. So the person playing the game can make these decisions. And then after they make their decisions, they hit enter, and the simulation runs for 1 year, gives them some information back, and then they can enter those numbers again and repeat. And the way that the game is designed, there are a lot of interdependencies, so the interactions are complex. And what the research was about was to look at how do people ask questions about the village that's being simulated as they make decisions. And long story short, after 10 years of running different kinds of experiments, they found that there was one behavior you can observe over and over again. This behavior is related to whether people make good decisions or make catastrophic errors. And the behavior is whether the person continues asking questions. It's the behavior of inquiry, active inquiry. And so as soon as the person playing the game stops asking questions, what's happening in their mind? They've created a mental representation of the system. And because they're not asking questions, they're no longer updating their mental model. The mental model is static, but the system is dynamic. It's continuing to change, which means after a couple of time steps, the gap between the mental model and the real model gets larger and larger, and they make huge mistakes.
Right.
And so this thing of remaining in inquiry, continuing to ask questions, is the acuity of discernment.
Right.
So as we're working with these complex systems, what they found was they would introduce a response, the researcher would introduce a response that if a certain number of time steps had gone by and the test subject had not asked a question, it would force them to ask a question before they could continue, and it dramatically improved their decisions. So you could actually create a management system to keep people in a mode of inquiry, which is important for dealing with dangerous complex systems like managing a nuclear reactor, for example. So it's just really interesting to see that acuity has a management part of it.
If the name of that study or if there's a book and so on, if any of that comes back to you, please let me know. I'd be fascinated to dig a little deeper with that. And I'm wondering if I could just take that particular thread just a little further with you. I'm curious, my experience of where we are now.
Oh, I just got the name of the book. The book is The Logic of Failure. The Logic of Failure by Dietrich Dorner.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So we started out with you describing a 2.5-year-old daughter and her particular capacity and way of being in the world, and all I could do when you were describing her was paste her natural responses all over my world and the world at large. Because I'm figuring right about now, the USA has about a 2.5-year-old girl's level of self-regulation on the collective level. And what I was just hearing you describe was some default tracks for our behavior when we're doing tasks or doing daily life, and especially when we're confronted with some sort of challenge or more. We seem to have a collective terror of uncertainty at any level. So what seems to, how that fits with what you were just describing for me is, as I'm more and more uncomfortable with even the possibility of any uncertainty, I will solidify whatever I can in the name of bolstering my inner hope of avoiding uncertainty and that fear and that disorientation. It's one thing when it's at the level of answering some questions or a problem at work, but it's so clearly gone to the national and global level, and it's so encased in shadow that's kind of twisting to a very cynical place our responses, our way of being together.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have anything to take that point you were just making, which is from the logic of failure to the kind of larger scale and more intense scale that I know you're very, very aware of in the world, and somehow addressing that terror of uncertainty and that terror of the groundlessness, which you mentioned just a little while ago, like having, and you've mentioned in one of your earlier articles, which I'll put in the show notes, about, we need training. We need to train for these new ways of being. And we are flat out just not trained in these distinctions and these powerful modalities that exist that would greatly assist us or give us alternatives to rigidifying our world and holding on so tight it would give us some facility at being able to let go when what letting go is clearly called for. So enough of my lead-in. I'm just curious if any of this sparks you to go to another level.
Yeah, there are two things. The thing about training, it's very important to be specific that the training that is needed is body-based training.
Mhm.
So like yoga, meditation, martial arts, dance, team sports. We have lots of ways that we can do it, but it's a body-based practice. So that's something that's very important to name, because many of us have done some kind of body-based practice before, even if it was just gym class in elementary school. And so that is at least familiar. It's not so strange to say, I could enroll in a martial arts class, or I could take yoga. That there's some simple things we can do to help us start to build these capacities.
Right.
But I also wanted to go to a high level and to share something that for me is really scary, but I think is really important to know. And that is that there was a study conducted by a group of researchers, anthropologists, historians, archaeologists, and evolutionary researchers all together. And what they did is they used the most comprehensive database that exists for different cultures. Just this database is called the Human Relation Area Files, HRAF, which is housed at Yale University. And the Human Relation Area Files is a database of anthropological information and archaeological information for a huge diversity of cultures, like hunter-gatherer societies, civilizations, everything. What they did was they created this study where they looked for different measures of disruption or conflict that were geographic. So like, where are the places where there are a lot of earthquakes? Where are there a lot of places where there are a lot of plagues or droughts? Where are the places where there are a lot of conflicts and violence? And when they geolocated those, and so they located them in place, and they located them in time, and then they went to this big database and they looked at the kinds of social dynamics that unfold. What they found was there was a universal pattern that in places where there were existential risk, which just means there's a high frequencies of these kinds of disruptions, so that communities feel a threat to their existence. In places where there's high existential risk, those societies either form fundamentalist religions or they establish fascist and totalitarian dictatorships, basically military warlord societies. And so now let's take climate change and the ecological crisis. What climate change does is creates the conditions for existential threat everywhere on Earth during the time when we need to be cultivating these capacities for discernment and acuity. So this is really scary and really dangerous for us, because we have to recognize that the large-scale dynamics of the world, like the ocean current, not the little waves on the top, the ocean current of the world is moving all of humanity toward fundamentalist religion and military dictatorships because of the uncertainty. Exactly what you were saying, the fear and the need for psychological belief. And we have to perceive that we're in control. We're not actually in control, but we have to believe it to deal with the stress and anxiety. That it's exactly that dynamic that is emerging everywhere on Earth because of the ecological crisis. So what we need to do is cultivate communities that have social feedbacks within them that counter this larger dynamic. Within those communities, we can create support groups that help us discern and manage things. But we always have the risk that the neighboring group becomes militaristic and invades us. And so this is the fundamental dynamic we have to work with in the next 50 to 100 years to deal with the climate crisis. So now go back to what you said earlier about these science communicators. Science communicators aren't thinking about this at all. They're pretty clueless about how Donald Trump got elected or how Bolsonaro got elected in Brazil.
Right.
But from this point of view, existential anxiety, the psychological dynamics of needing the perception of control, and the psychopaths and sociopaths who will take advantage of it, who will exploit the existing militaries and fundamentalist religions. I mean, you can see the scenario.
Yeah.
And it's a very ugly scenario.
Yeah.
But it's in that place that we have to do a special kind of intervention, which is we have to do regenerative education. Regenerative education is creating learning environments that regenerate our abilities to manage our emotions.
Yeah.
And that is the fundamental work for all of the environmental restoration, community development, human rights, protecting women against violence. Pick your political issue.
Yeah.
We have to regenerate this human capacity.
Yeah. Well, that's very, we are right in the center of where I'm generating my body of work. That, what are literally the tools that could be chosen by a given concerned participant to create their own inner toolkit for the expansion of their own capacities to be present in the face of ever larger stressors, and then to be able to build out that their toolkit, the processes, the practices that essentially are aimed at reconnecting with the primary sources of meaning in human life that we have all, to a very great degree, disconnected from. So I hear you. I mean, it's just like water on a desert to hear you articulate that last point. I absolutely couldn't agree more. How, unless you wanted to go in a different direction, I'd be curious how you find inspiration when you scan what's going on. Are there many providers for the quality of educational experience that you're talking about? I look around, and I've been looking hard. I've found a handful, and I'm doing my best to glom on and make partnerships, and let's create together, because there are far too few. I'm hoping you're going to set me straight and tell me how many there are somewhere, so I can go find out, go get to know them as well.
What I'm discovering is that there are a lot of them, but all of them are small and they're disconnected from each other.
Mm-hmm.
And like here I am, my family moved to Costa Rica about 8 months ago, and we're starting to map out different projects for regenerative design, where people do permaculture work or reforestation, whatever it is that they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're finding is all over Costa Rica, just go over to that mountain valley, you'll find one. They're everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't know about each other. And even if they do know about a few of the others, they're not actively creating a network. And so the problem that we have right now is a problem of integration. And there are many reasons for this problem, but I think probably the largest scale reason is what I call the global architecture of wealth extraction,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which is that, by the best measures, we have somewhere around $30 trillion hidden away in tax havens. 30% of the global economy has been extracted and hoarded by a tiny percentage of the population.
Yeah.
And the consequence is everyone else is in debt and everyone else has scarcity. And the scarcity is artificial because the whole system is extractive, and those who hoard money the best have just taken all of it. There are 1,400 billionaires, and there are 4 billion people who are in extreme poverty.
Mm-hmm.
That is not an accident.
Yeah.
That's created by design. And so this need for integration, the problem of integration, if I were to call it the problem of integration, is the problem of finding the resources to create the capacities for integration when no one has enough resources even to manage their own projects.
Right.
And so this is no longer a problem. It's now moved to the level of a predicament.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have a solution in the normal sense. We have to navigate our way to patterns of restoration, because right now we don't have the basic capacities to create what we need. And
Joe,
so there are a lot of them, but none of them are at capacity.
I just want you to know how deeply depressed I am now that you've given me that dismal predicament answer here on the Poetry of Predicament podcast.
Yeah, it's really a difficult place, but we need to be honest with ourselves
Of course.
about what the capacities are not. You know,
Yeah.
we can't pretend they're something else.
Yep.
Now there is another thing, which is, you know, I've studied a lot of evolutionary science and think about it in the way that Charles Darwin articulated it, and that was later refined by the mathematics of population genetics. And this is important because there was a period of about 50 years after Charles Darwin articulated his theory of natural selection. For 50 years, most of biology, the research community, thought that they had disproven Darwin's work and that he was wrong. And it turned out that they were all wrong because they didn't have the skills of doing statistics to add up the traits within the population of a species to measure it correctly. And when a group of mathematicians who specialized in statistical accounting methods came along in the 1920s and created the mathematical tools for what became population genetics, which is the statistics for populations, then they found that when they added it all up, Darwin's theory was the only theory that made sense. And I share this because when we are talking about the predicament of humanity, which is a version of what we were just talking about, a version of the predicament of humanity. The question that comes out from an evolutionary point of view is a statistical question, which is within the population of all human cultures, which human cultures have the traits, the composition of capacities that as the human population gets much smaller, think of it as a filter. There's a filter in time. Most of the population doesn't pass the filter. A small part of it does. This is the collapse of the human population.
Mm-hmm.
But we look at it through a Darwinian lens that we have this tiny number, this small percentage of the population that passes through. And the question is, what are the cultural traits of those cultures that pass through that filter? And if the cultures that exist after the collapse are extractive, parasitic, wealth hoarding, then we'll just reproduce the system that we have now, and the eventual outcome is human extinction. But if the composition of those cultures that pass through are regenerative, are based on the principles of living systems, they're symbiotic, they co-create with their natural environments, you know, they're part of their natural environments, you know, they understand themselves in this way, then it's possible that we can regrow the human population, not to the level it is now, but to some resilient level that keeps humans from going extinct.
Yeah.
Now, I consider this low probability. I don't, you know, I'm honest with myself. I don't think we have good chances. But I also am honest with myself that I'm ignorant, that I don't know that we're guaranteed to go extinct. So the best thing that I can do is create a strategy based on the best information that I can find, which includes this kind of thinking. And then I invest in those cultures, those small communities that are regenerative, to try to give them the best chance of surviving the collapse.
Yeah.
And that's, for me, that's the best strategy I can find with all of my learning. And of course, there are patterns of the Earth system that may mean that it's too late and we are going to go extinct no matter what we do. That's a possibility I have to accept to be able to handle the grief of what's happening. You know, I don't go to that depressed place because I want to be depressed. I go to that depressed place so that I can still believe in my strategy. And I need to believe in my strategy, even if there's a faith component to it, because it's partly based in ignorance. Well, that's okay. I can handle that.
If I may, Joe, I just need to add something in what I've heard you say and just run it by you to see if this fits how you see yourself. It seems like, yes, that strategy is there at the center, and you need to keep that in place just as a kind of a homing beacon for yourself. But there's also part of that training, that embodiment training, is also the embodiment of an ever-expanding awareness of what's actually so in the world at any given time. So that's kind of the good news and the bad news about becoming more and more aware, is we become more aware with all of its beauty and miraculousness of being alive, and then it's also the expansion of the awareness of how we're killing ourselves and millions of other species and so on.
Yeah,
So it's both a dual-edged sword, and I just needed to mention that because that's very much my experience of the various trainings I've been involved with in my life, that the being on the mat, so to speak, is always the expansion of the fullness of being alive, with the pain of being sucked in the nose, and also the beauty of the art of our moving together on the mat.
Yeah, and we need to be very careful not to fall into what some more mystical thinkers call a glimmer. Now, a glimmer is an illusory dream, an imagined reality that is so appealing that we get attached to it, but it's not real. So then we're living in a delusion. And so we have to be very careful about this.
That means we're living in a delusion and looking forward to a delusion.
Yeah. We're looking forward to delusion. And go back to your basic cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy is, I have a story about what my behavior does in the world. I act out the behavior. The story is pathological because the story is not true. And so I act out a behavior that reproduces the conditions of my trauma, which then creates the same behavior. Repeat, repeat, repeat. So cognitive behavioral therapy is looking at that story, changing the behavior and changing the story, till eventually the behavior creates an outcome that actually matches the world. Mm-hmm. And so it's that process that we're doing when we're on the mat, as you said. Yeah. Because we're going to get trapped in these stories as part of the process too, and then get ourselves unstuck. That's part of it.
Yeah.
What I think is really important is, I don't want to so much normalize this process, is I just want to have people who are in it to know that this is how the process works.
Yeah.
So all of these complex emotions that you're describing, the good and the bad, that's part of how this works. Yeah. Which is why we need training, and it's body-based training.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Joe, I can feel the window of our time starting to close a little bit, and I know that almost any 2-minute segment of our conversation together could be excerpted for suggestions for a person wanting to bridge from their current reality, to something better. And I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind just taking a moment with us for one last sweep at it. If you could imagine this tiny little podcast getting a multi-billion person audience that was very much in favor of the conversation, and you had a couple of minutes to offer what you've seen in your own experience and in your own heart, just being a human being who wants the best for life on Earth. Could you share with us anything from your heart to ours that you could offer?
Yeah, something that I'll start with something more like pragmatic, and then I'll go into the heart from it, because I think it may help.
Thank you.
Something very pragmatic is I've learned from experience that the capacity for regeneration is limited by the ego, emotion capacities of the leadership in the work. So if you're in a group of people and someone in the group has problems with their ego, has insecurities, feels threatened, things like this, then that project is not going to go very far. And one of the skills you need to develop is the ability to see who is worth being on a team with that can actually do something. And it's not about the quality of the ideas, it's not about the quality of the education, it's about the quality of the social and emotional capacities to be in relationship. This is really, really important because I have chased good ideas where I go and work with someone because they're brilliant, but they're an asshole and they're hard to work with. And they direct all the projects toward themselves because their ego is insecure. And that's why we see them as brilliant. And those projects don't go anywhere. And so this is really, really important that if you care about making a change in the world, there are a lot of things you can do. There really are a lot of things you can do, but you can't do them alone. You need to find other people to do them with. And you need to be sure those other people are capable of being in a relationship. And so this is very practical advice that I have learned through a lot of ignorance and stupidity over the years.
I call that the naive part of me, which sounds like it's the same one as you got.
I look for good things in people, and sometimes that's all I see. And so, speaking of glimmers, so it's just part of this. And then the other thing I would say is that there's something really beautiful, even if humanity ends up going extinct, even if in the worst scenarios for us as human beings. Think of this. We are in a time in history where we actually can be the earth, knowing the earth in ways that are truly incredible. Now let's just take satellite data. We have satellites and we look at these patterns of the earth. We see the mixing of the ocean and the breathing of the earth with the photosynthesis as the trees, the deciduous trees, strip off their leaves and grow them back. And see the greening and the receding of the forest and all these incredible things. And we are part of the earth. So this huge infrastructure that we built is the earth knowing itself. And so whatever happens from here, it's incredible that the planet, I kind of separate the planet as the earth is the whole system and the living consciousness and capacities, which is the biosphere for 3.8 billion years. I call that part Gaia, just to give it a spiritual tone, because I think we need to honor and revere the life system of the earth. That the Gaia process, this intelligence and life that's gone for 3.8 billion years, has produced us. And we are part of it. And there's something amazing about a planet creating a Gaia and then having Gaia create this capacity to know and love itself. So for those of us who try to regenerate the earth, we are Gaia, loving Gaia. I mean, isn't that incredible? And so if you want to find meaning, regardless of the outcome, just let it wash over you how beautiful it is to know that you are Gaia as part of the earth, knowing and loving Gaia. But you're only doing that when you're acting to regenerate the earth. So to fill your life with regenerative practice is to bask in the love of yourself as part of the planet. It's just incredible. So that doesn't depend on the outcome. Now, we really do care about the outcome too. I'm not meaning to dismiss it, but isn't that amazing that we could live our lives in that relationship to such a deep part of not just ourselves, but all life that we know exists in the universe. It's just amazing.
I think it's pretty safe with this audience that you're talking about releasing outcome, it's an easy point to hear at this particular stage of the conversation, that is the poetry of predicament and this body of work. People are very used to hearing that and taking that on, that challenge on. Yeah. Joe, it's just, I knew it would be great to speak with you. And it's been way too long. I first reached out to you back when you used to live in Oregon, I believe. And I'm sorry you're further away, but maybe, just maybe, I can convince my sweetheart we can come and visit you in the place where you live and do your work. Would you like to say anything about that place and the education that you offer there? I believe you have some stuff coming up, and I'd love to give you as much opportunity as you would like to speak about that.
Yeah, I would say we're currently at a place called Rancho Margot, but our family has recently made the decision that we need to transition to the next place, just because it's not a good enough match for the environment we need for our daughter. It's too much of a hotel culture in the way the place is managed, and it just creates tensions. And it's a really beautiful place and we love it, but it's not really the place for us to be.
Got it.
So we're staying there until mid-September, and then we're going to move away. I do have a workshop coming up in a few weeks about how to manage planetary collapse. And it's really deeply aligned with your work, and what this podcast is about is, in a social way, preparing ourselves to do this larger regenerative work. But I think it's less, I feel less motivated to promote my own workshop offerings, and more encouraged to promote this idea that I'm helping to steward at the moment, which is the idea of creating a global network of regenerative campuses, which is to take existing learning centers or newly forming learning centers, which there are tens of thousands of them. If you think about eco-villages around the world, or community learning centers, retreat centers, like the tens of thousands of them, to treat each of them as potentially a place for learning regeneration by practicing regeneration in the landscape.
Yeah.
And so I'm helping to hold this vision along with a network of other people. And I really want to encourage anyone who feels like their calling is this cultivation of human capacities, or this cultivation of environmental restoration on community development capacities, whatever level they're working at, to think about connecting to a place with a learning center that supports that place, while at the same time connecting that place to a network of other places. I'm doing this work, so if you get closer to the work that I'm doing and follow me on social media, all those things, then you can find your way into this world with the weaving of networks that I'm doing. But you can also do it with your own. What I feel is needed is that we just create a global tapestry of regenerative campuses that are stewarding the land in their own backyards.
Joe, do you have a web address that people could use as a hub to find out about the things you're talking about right now?
Yeah, we have a project called Regenerative Communities Network, and the website is regenerativecommunities.net.
Yeah, I'll put that in the show notes. Are there any other addresses or resources that you want to mention now, or will they find it there?
No, I mean, you could send people to my Patreon page if they want to support my work, which is patreon.com/Joe_Brewer, or find me on Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter, and just grab those links.
Yeah.
I make myself easy to find. I do have a Medium account where I've written about 300 articles there, but I'm less active blogging these days just because of the dynamic of the work. But I will be blogging in the future. So any of those that you'd like to share, I'm not really trying to promote myself here. I'm really trying to promote the larger world. But anyone who wants to connect with me, I always welcome it.
All right. Well, Joe, thank you again very much for your obvious heart and passion for reconnecting with life. And thank you so much for spending time with me and with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
All right. I look forward to our next time.
Yeah, me too. All right.
Take care, brother.
Bye.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.